Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football podcast by Joel Haas of the Post-Gazette and the Daily Collegian. Got a lot to talk about today. It is Ohio State week. There's an injury situation at quarterback, so there's a lot for Penn State to deal with in that situation. Still got some stuff to react to from the Wisconsin game that I thought was noteworthy. And obviously, there's a lot of injuries around Penn State's squad. So Joel's going to update us on that. Before we get to all of that, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast, Voodoo Brewing Company, State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company, State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and at Route 322. And Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for our weekly free play cornhole tournaments, or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is our game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, but this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have the Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off Sundays with our weekly brunch, paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. All right, Joel, let's get into this. And I think this is the question of the week, given, the way James Franklin described the situation at quarterback with Drew Allar and Beau Pribula, that it might go down to a game time decision, that Drew Allar has the experience, that, James Franklin trusts him to go back in there if he doesn't get a lot of reps this week in practice. So they might be able to say, on Saturday morning, yeah, we think he can go. No, we don't think he can. So my question for you is, where do you think that percentage of Drew Allar sits? Is 80% of Drew Allar better than 100% of Beau Pribula? Is it 85? Where do you think he has to get to health-wise for him to be a better option for the Nittany Lions in this massive game at Beaver Stadium?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we heard from Franklin that he had a talk with Allar. Allar came out of the tunnel after halftime and started warming up, and then went over to Franklin, and they kind of talked about it. And Franklin said that Allar was, quote, very, very honest with him. And basically Allar said that he didn't feel he had the mobility to really be able to lead Penn State in that second half. And that's why they kind of passed it off to Beau Pribula. So, and then I've seen kind of some mixed reports about whether it's a knee, whether it's an ankle, but regardless, it's some sort of lower body leg injury there. So obviously I think the big thing is that it takes away Allar's mobility. I don't think he has, really any ability to scramble. And I think in terms of throwing the ball, maybe he would be okay. But I think the big thing is you're just not sure about his running ability. And I think that's a big thing in this matchup. Obviously Penn State or Ohio State is very talented at defensive end with JTT. We all saw what he was able to do against Penn State a couple of years ago. Some other guys like Jack Sawyer, on that defensive line that are going to make things really tough for Penn State. And so I think you want to have the ability to have a mobile quarterback. And so I think if Drew's, if his leg is anything less than, 90%, 85%, something in that range, you probably don't trust him to go out there, especially with what Beau can bring on the ground. I think that's a really good skill set to have against this Ohio State team that has a really good defense, really good defensive line, as they always seem to have. So yeah, I think unless Drew's, 90% or better, I think you don't even risk sending him out there.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting decision to watch. And I wonder too, Joel, if they might want to mix the two of them in there and say, kind of like they did with Sean Clifford and Will Levis a few years back. Will Levis kind of came in as the change of pace in the middle of that one game at Ohio State and had some success. Different situation in that I don't think Beau Pribula is really a threat to the starting job for Drew Allar or anything like that. But I'd be curious if maybe, Drew Allar is right around that 85-90% mark. Do you go with him but bring Beau Pribula in for a whole drive or something and mix in some runs and stuff like that? Or we've seen them on the field at the same time a fair amount. Do they do more of that where Beau is out there, maybe Beau's taking the snap and you do some things like you did against USC. I think it makes it even more difficult for Ohio State to prepare because I do think those are options for Penn State. I think ideally you'd like to have Drew Allar in there 98% of the time, but I wonder if there could be some mixing and matching given the situation. Let's say that Drew can't go, though, or for whatever reason he aggravates the injury in the game and they have to go back to Beau for large stretches, 2-3 quarters, something like that. Did you see enough from him throwing the ball at Wisconsin to believe that Penn State has a legit chance to win this game against this team that has been their bugaboo for so long, and that this isn't going to be kind of if he does have to play an extensive amount, that this isn't going to be a Will Levis situation where they brought him in but never really trusted him to throw, and he was really just in there to kind of run?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, when you look at the Wisconsin game, obviously he finished with some really good stats. I think it was 11 for 13 passing for about 100 yards and a touchdown. But, just watching the game, some of those throws were a little risky. He kind of fit the ball into some tight windows. And a lot of the time it looked like there were defensive backs who were kind of right there in the area and the ball maybe went through their hands or something like that. There were a couple of throws that I thought, could have potentially been picked off just because of how dangerous they were. So from that aspect, that worries me a little bit because obviously Ohio State's defense is going to be on another level compared to what Penn State saw against Wisconsin. And I'm worried that, if you try to send Beau out there and, have him air the ball out, it could end up getting ugly if he starts, 1 or 2 turnovers early, something like that puts Penn State in a hole. And then all of a sudden that could turn into some kind of complete collapse. Obviously we know his strength lies on the ground, and I think Penn State would be smart to rely on that. But I mean, I think if he does have to air it out, I don't think you want to ask him to do too much. Like, obviously you have to pass the ball, you have to be more than just, a running team. You have to be multi-dimensional, obviously, just to give Ohio State different looks and things like that and put a little bit more stress on them. But I also don't think you can be, he can't do what Drew can do. Like, simply put, he's not going to be able to air the ball out in the same way that Drew can. He doesn't have the same arm talent and things like that. So you have to be careful with kind of the plays that you're drawing up for him. I would expect, screens and a lot of short passes and slants and things like that. And obviously, that's probably what Ohio State's expecting as well. So it's a little bit tricky because they're probably not anticipating him to air it out or anything like that. But I think you have to be cautious with Beau. I do think the Wisconsin game kind of goes a long way because obviously that was the most pass attempts we've ever seen from Beau, and obviously the numbers were there. The completion percentage was very high, and he looked pretty good leading the offense. And so I think just his performance last week goes a long way for what Ohio State has to do. We heard from Ryan Day earlier this week during his media. He said that they were preparing for both quarterbacks equally. And so obviously they're anticipating, they're not sure either, just like us, but they're kind of expecting that Beau will play some kind of role, whether, he starts the game or not. I think Beau will be involved, but just to go back to the original question, I think you do have to be more cautious with Beau in the game. Definitely. I don't think you can allow him to pass the ball in the same way that Allar can. But I think one of the interesting things is that Beau almost fits, I think, what Nittany likes to do more. When you look at what he was able to do with those quarterbacks at Kansas, with Daniels and being at Kansas, both of those guys were mobile quarterbacks, and Nittany kind of had a lot of fun scheming some things up for them, getting them involved with, option plays and different things like that. And so I think with Beau, his skill set fits a little bit more what Nittany has experience doing. And so I think there are a lot of things that Penn State, maybe didn't show against Wisconsin that could potentially bring out with Beau and not with Drew. So I think, it's just a different skill set. But I don't think he has the ability to air it out in the same way that Drew does. And I think you have to be really cautious if you're Penn State, and you have to understand that, you can't be asking him to do too much because, again, if he, throws an interception early or, something like that, some kind of costly mistake, you definitely don't want to get down. And obviously he would, from a mental standpoint, making a big mistake or something like that through the air early would kind of scare not only Beau, but also just the coaching staff. I think would be kind of worried to call any more passing plays if something like that happens. So you have to be careful. I would say kind of ease Beau into the game and just short stuff, things like that.
I wanted to ask, obviously that's a different skill set than Drew Allar, but where do you think Beau Pribula lies on the Trace McSorley continuum? Because I think it's a little too convenient a comparison at times because they both wear number 9. They're both kind of smaller guys. I've always thought that Beau had a little bit of pluck to his game when we've seen him at times last season, and then obviously stepping in the way that he did Saturday night. I was calling him War Daddy Pribula, kind of making that comparison to Trace McSorley. But listen, downfield throwing was a part of Trace McSorley's game. I think it evolved over time. I think in that game against Ohio State, the Penn State blocked the field goal, ends up upsetting Ohio State at home, then goes on to win the Rose. That particular game, I think it seemed like a similar game plan for him. But by the end of the year, obviously he was cutting loose nukes all the time down the field. So how would you compare Beau Pribula to Trace McSorley? Is that a fair comp, or are we just doing kind of the visual and making them seem maybe more similar than they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some validity to that comparison. I would call Beau almost, a Trace McSorley light. Just kind of, follows the similar mold, similar skill set, just maybe not as effective, especially in the passing game. Obviously, Trace had kind of that cannon of an arm that I don't think Beau has. In terms of their physical ability, I think, obviously both great runners, both kind of freak athletes in that regard. So, and then obviously the comparisons that you mentioned with, wearing number 9 and just kind of the moxie that they have and things like that. And obviously Beau grew up as a Penn State fan and was watching Trace and things like that. So maybe, took some elements from his game and things like that. But I mean, I do think there is some validity to that comparison. Again, I just from a sheer passing standpoint, I don't think Beau really stacks up, but in terms of play style, I think, his ability with his legs definitely puts him in a similar category as what Penn State had with Trace.
Before we move on, Joel, I just wanted to see, are there any other injuries you felt worth updating us about? Because there were a slew of them that James Franklin was asked about on Monday. And rather than go one by one, I figured just what stood out to you about the injury situation as he had described it?
Yeah. Franklin loves to really not say anything when he gets asked about these injuries. And it's always kind of tough to ask him about those types of things. But obviously he kind of, deferred on the QB situation, said it would be a game time decision. He said the same thing about starting right tackle Anthony Donko, who went down in the first half of the Wisconsin game. Nolan Rucci came in to replace him there. And then, we're still not sure about his status. That was another one that Franklin said would probably be a game time decision. Defensively, denied Dennis Sutton, obviously a key player at defensive end, went down in the first half. All these guys going down in the first half, I believe all in the second quarter. And denied Dennis Sutton came out for the third quarter, came out at halftime. I think he split a tackle for loss. He had like half a tackle for loss on the first play of the third quarter. Immediately came up after making that tackle and kind of limped off to the sideline and never came back into that game. So, obviously they evaluated him at halftime, thought he would be able to go. He came out there for one play and then they had to take him back out again. But, the fact that they would bring him out for that third quarter tells me, they didn't think it was too serious of an injury. Obviously, whatever happened when he did go back out on that first play was, more serious than what they had thought. And it was, the injury was obviously still bothering him, but that makes me think it's not long-term. But, we didn't get any sort of answer from Franklin there. So that'll likely go down to game time. And even when that availability report drops 2 hours before the game, he'll probably just be listed as questionable. So we probably won't get any insight until the actual kickoff of the game. But I mean, all those guys, between Drew, Donko, Deni Dennis Sutton, all of them play at, key positions of quarterback, offensive tackle, defensive end. There's a reason why those positions are very highly valued in the NFL draft every year. And some of the top picks are from those positions. I mean, those are key players for Penn State that are all out. Ohio State's also dealing with some injuries. They've lost 2 left tackles now. So they're on a kind of a third string. I think they bumped one of the guards over. So they're also dealing with some injuries. But yeah, I think both teams are a little bit banged up heading into this one.
I want to get into this Will Howard stuff. The Ohio State quarterback has had some, I think, viral comments that most people have probably seen. If you didn't, he was asked, what his level of excitement was to face Penn State after he grew up a Penn State fan in Eastern PA, wanted to go to Penn State his whole life, but ultimately was not recruited by James Franklin and Penn State. And Will Howard didn't hold back. He said he was stoked, and he was looking forward to seeing whether he should have been good enough for Penn State to consider. I don't think Penn State needs bulletin board material, so I'm not going to ask the question in that way, Joel. I mean, this is a team they've got to beat to get to where they want to go. That should be motivation enough. So I guess the bigger question is, do you look at Will Howard as a recruiting miss for Penn State, even though he's now the quarterback of your biggest rival? I look at the situation and say, I don't know that I really could have imagined things going very differently, just in terms of who was at the top of the depth chart. James Franklin was devoted to Sean Clifford, even when it was very unpopular. When people like me on this very podcast were saying it's time to go to Drew Allar, he stuck with him. They go and they win a Rose Bowl. So I can't imagine a situation where Will Howard had come in here and unseated Sean Clifford in the same way Drew Allar couldn't. And now you have Drew Allar, a guy with a very high pedigree that a lot of people see as potentially having the most upside Penn State's had at that position in a lot of years. Do you envision a world where Will Howard could have been a player in this quarterback room? Just knowing that he would end up where he did today, or if you told James Franklin in 2020 during that recruiting cycle that, hey, this guy's going to start against you in a huge game in about 4 years, do you think he would have done anything differently? Because I don't.
No, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, the comments about, we'll see if he was good enough or whatever, because Penn State wasn't recruiting him out of high school. I mean, Ohio State wasn't recruiting him either. And quite frankly, there were only a couple power schools that were recruiting him. Kansas State was obviously one of them, and that's where he ended up going. But, he was a 3-star and not even one of the higher, 3 stars, because sometimes guys are on the border of 4-star status, but he wasn't ranked very highly. He wasn't thought of very highly across the industry. Obviously, he's a guy from Pennsylvania. So if you're Penn State, you want to have maybe a greater evaluation and kind of be able to find those hidden gems, especially when they're in state. So, if you're Penn State, hindsight 2020, obviously, maybe you would have gone back and offered him. But at the same time, this is a guy who's in his 5th year playing college football. He spent 4 years at Kansas State. And, you look at his progression over that time, he's obviously gotten better over the years. But I think, looking back at kind of when he was being recruited, there was no way to really tell that, throughout his years of college that he would go through kind of an upward progression every year and get to the point where he is now. I mean, like he's a completely different person this year than he was back when he was being recruited, just because of the amount of time he spent in college football and things like that. So, I mean, you could argue that regardless of, what school he went to, he would have had that kind of level of success, but I don't think you can really blame Penn State here. I mean, obviously he was a PA kid, but he wasn't getting offers from there were a few power conference schools. I think Kansas State, Kansas, and Minnesota were the 3 power schools who offered him. So obviously he wasn't drawing kind of national attention or anything like that. And his recruiting ranking wasn't, super high up there. So I think if you're Penn State, you're okay with the decision. Maybe you would change it in hindsight, but, regardless, I think you're pretty happy with where you ended up with Drew Allar.
Joel, I wanted to ask you, just kind of going down the Penn State box score from the other night, specifically with the receivers. So many different guys involved. Harrison Wallace, 5 catches for 67 yards. Tyler Warren, 7 for 46. Liam Clifford, 3 for 40. Nick Singleton, 3 for 37. Katron Allen, 4 for 22. Khalil Dinkins, 2 for 18, including that one touchdown. Julian Fleming gets 1 for 16. Kind of reminded me of the Steelers box score this past week, where Russell Wilson was getting a lot of different guys involved. And there's no, I don't think, dominant pass catcher in this group, except maybe Tyler Warren, but I don't think you look at him, the same way you would like a Jahan Dotson or a KJ Hamler when those guys were racking up tons of targets, just because of the nature of his position. But I think you're getting to a point where they're showing that they have a lot of different weapons. And I think that this is maybe the deepest group of pass catchers Penn State has had in some times, in terms of guys that you trust to make plays in tough situations. Obviously, Fleming didn't have a ton of stats this week, but had the huge catches at USC. Is that what we're seeing with this Penn State offense? Is that maybe it's not, doesn't have the raw talent of some of James Franklin's receivers rooms, in the past, but certainly has the ability to threaten opposing defense just with the range of viable targets that they have?
Yeah, I think that's fair. You can obviously, look at their wide receiver one, whoever you want to say it is this year. You can look at Harrison Wallace and then, you look backwards over the past few years. I think this is probably the worst, at the very top of the room, probably the worst wide receiver one Penn State has had for the last decade or so, because it feels like even though the room hasn't had, great depth throughout Franklin's tenure. They've always kind of had that one guy at the top, regardless of who that's been. And I think they're kind of missing that this year. Like you mentioned, Tyler Warren has obviously done a great job, but again, you don't want your tight end to be, kind of your number one receiver. You want to have a wide receiver who's up there with, whatever 1,200 yards. And I don't know if anyone on Penn State's roster is gonna pass 1,000 this year. If anyone does, it'll probably be Warren. But regardless, you were probably hoping for more from that wide receiver room. But to your point, I think you could argue that there's more depth this year than they've had in the past. I think part of it goes back to, again, Tyler Warren, but also the running backs with Singleton and Allen, who have both gotten involved in the passing game a little bit more this year compared to what they've done in past years. And I think Penn State's done a good job of spreading the ball around to different guys. They don't have that kind of number one wide receiver, which I think kind of hurts them a little bit, especially in this game against Ohio State. We saw against Oregon, Ohio State, their top corner Denzel Burke was kind of getting burnt on a few plays there, giving up some big plays, and the announcers were kind of calling him out. Which I thought was a little bit funny. A lot of people were kind of saying, Denzel Burke lost a lot of draft stock after that game against Oregon, but obviously Penn State's wide receivers aren't on that same level as Oregon's, or at least haven't been so far. And so I don't know if Penn State's built to take advantage of that, because Ohio State, still has a great secondary regardless of struggles against Oregon. They've still been great against pretty much everybody else outside of the Ducks, who have a great receiver corps. So I don't know if Penn State's necessarily built to take advantage of it, but yeah, I think they do have good depth. I think they've got a bunch of different guys who have at different times kind of flashed. With I think it's 4 different guys who have had 100 plus receiving yard games. But I think you're just looking for more consistency, or for some of them to kind of develop as clear leaders. Harrison Wallace has been kind of hot and cold. Warren's been consistent, but again, you want it from a receiver more than a tight end. And then, a guy like Julian Fleming, who you brought in with the hopes of him pushing for, a wide receiver one role, is obviously we saw the big drop he had against Wisconsin. He's just been very inconsistent as well. I think that's kind of just been a theme among all of the guys in that wide receiver room. So, I don't know if I would go so far as to call it the worst wide receiver room under Franklin, but it's definitely, the worst at the top end.
Yeah, it's what it's lacking in quality. You hope it makes up for in quantity. And we've seen that on different occasions. We'll be curious to see how that plays out against a team of Ohio State's caliber. Going back to another discussion we had last week, Joel, it was about the linebackers and how they would step up against Wisconsin's running game after kind of struggling out at USC. Toby Walker, they held him to 2.7 yards per carry. So I think it was a pretty nice effort, but obviously you're going up against 2 of the toughest guys in the country this week, TreVeyon Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, who they saw, in the past. So what's your read on the Penn State linebackers' readiness for this challenge? And do you think they can do what Nebraska was able to do this past week, held both of those guys under 30 yards to kind of keep themselves in the game?
I think so. I think more than anything, it'll probably come down to Penn State's defensive ends kind of being able to get in there. I talked about Ohio State's struggles at left tackle, now being down to their third string there. I think that's obviously an area where Penn State can take advantage, whether it's Abdul or if Dennis Sutton plays or whoever they have lined up there. They've obviously got depth there. And to your point with the linebackers, obviously they'll play a big part in the run defense, and we saw what Nebraska was able to do against Ohio State last weekend. But I think the problem with kind of trying to make that comparison there is that this Ohio State team is going to look completely different than it did against Nebraska. And I think that's just, always the case. As much as Penn State, probably hates to see it, Ohio State seems to always bring its A game when it plays Penn State. Ohio State, they might get caught sleeping against other opponents, but they're not going to do the same thing against Penn State. Penn State's always going to get the best shot from the Buckeyes. And so I think Ohio State will be a little bit more prepared this week. We'll play a little bit better. Like you mentioned, that kind of two-headed monster at running back, probably two of the top 5 running backs in college football, which is kind of ridiculous that they just have that stable in the backfield there. And Penn State's going to have to do its best to limit that. But again, Ohio State, they can burn you in the passing game too. We obviously know what they've produced out of that wide receiver room in recent years, and they've still got a bunch of guys in that room this year. whether it's Emeka Egbuka or the freshman Jeremiah Smith. They've just got a ton of guys there, good depth. So I think Penn State will be tested all around. And the problem here, and the linebackers are kind of relevant to this, is that if you're Penn State, you can't key in on any one thing. There's not one position group that you can kind of lock in on, from receivers to tight ends to running backs to, even Will Howard and his throwing ability. You can't just kind of key in on any sort of weakness, because this team is so good and so well-rounded at every position. And I think that makes it difficult, because you can't just tell the linebackers to watch for one specific thing. They have to be very smart with the way that they play and things like that. But we got to talk to Kobe King, who's obviously a key piece of the offense. He wears the green dot helmet, so he's got the sideline communication. He's the one calling the plays, directing things defensively. We got to talk to him, and as much as, and it was interesting because if you ask Franklin about this game or any game, he's going to give you the same answer, and he's going to say that Penn State's focused on 1-0. They're not changing their process. They're treating every opponent the same. But and even when you ask the players, you'll kind of get the same answer, that generic answer. And it becomes obvious that, right, that's what they've been directed to say. That's what's been drilled into their head. Kobe King, I thought, was a little bit more candid with his answer, which I love, because it wasn't just the generic stuff that we've been getting from everyone. He actually said, it is different. Like, there is a different feel in the building. Things are a little bit more tense. They're bringing a little bit more energy in practice. He admitted that this is a big game. The team recognizes it, and it doesn't feel the same as any other game. So they know they're going to have to bring their A game for this one, and obviously step up. And this will obviously be their biggest test on both sides of the ball. But yeah, especially for the linebackers. I mean, we've seen some good, we've seen some bad. I think if they play similar to how they did against Wisconsin and do a good job of bottling up that run, that'll be a big thing for Penn State, obviously, to if they want to come out with a win.
Is this their best shot at Ohio State since the pandemic? Obviously, they went into 17, 18, 19 thinking they could win because they won in 16, and they had their chances in all three of those games. And these programs felt very much like peers in that period of time, even though Ohio State got the better of Penn State 3 out of those 4 years. You felt like they were on relatively even ground. I think since 2020, 21, 22, 23, that feeling that air has slowly been let out of the balloon. And there's I think, widespread belief at this point that the Penn State is a rung below Ohio State, and that it's going to take kind of Herculean efforts to beat them, as you maybe felt back in 14, 15, 16, when Ohio State was kind of at the peak of its dominance, before falling off a little bit against some of the better programs in recent years. I think the spread is 3.5, which I think reflects what we're talking about in that respect of these teams look like they're pretty close on paper. Ohio State's probably, the team that you're going to pick, that you're going to give them that 60-40 edge. But do you think that spread is right? And B, does this feel like the best shot Penn State's had in several years?
So, for the first part of your question, I do think that the spread is fair. I think, Ohio State just, again, on paper is the better team. They obviously had the loss to Oregon, but that's pretty much the best possible loss that any team could have in terms of resume. It's a 1-point loss on the road to the number 1 team in the country. So if you're going to lose, that's what you want the loss to be, as far as your resume goes. And I don't really knock Ohio State for that at all. You could even argue they were the better team in that game. And I do think they're the better team heading into this game against Penn State. Again, I think it'll be close. I also think the environment will probably play a big role. Obviously, the fans are excited for this game. And I've seen, on Twitter, people are talking about, potentially setting an attendance record. I saw James Franklin retweeted something about that. And so obviously, the fans are pretty excited for this game. But I think it's funny because as long as I've been following this team, it feels like every year heading into the Ohio State game, Penn State fans are able to convince themselves that, this is the year that they're going to win. And it almost feels like this year is the exact opposite, at least from what I've been seeing on, social media and just kind of talking to people around campus and things like that. It feels like Penn State fans have gotten their hopes up so many times heading into the Ohio State game. And their hopes have just been crushed and destroyed. And obviously we've seen kind of the fallout after these losses to Ohio State every year, where people are calling for Franklin to be fired and, whatever it is, and going crazy on social media and things like that. And I think it's kind of ironic because I think this year people have been beaten down so much, and that they're not even willing to say that. I think if you poll Penn State fans,
is part of it, Joel. Sorry to interrupt you, but you think part of it too is this playoff conversation? Because that's where I'm going to try to take the discussion here. Is, do you think people are baking this in as a loss because they don't need it to get where they want to go? Which is, I think a lot of Penn State fans have set the bar at just get into the playoff and see what happens. I kind of look at it differently. We've been talking about it. It's been a theme of the podcast that I think looking at just getting into the 12-team format is a bad way to think about it, because if your goal is to see Penn State win a national championship or play in those massive semifinal games, then you want to avoid playing in those first-round games. You want to be the higher seed. So and I look at this game and I say this has as high stakes as any of these games have had. I think other people don't perceive it that way, but I think this is make or break to make the conference title game, Joel, which you need to win the conference championship to get one of those top 4 seeds in a bye. But you just look at the situation right now. If you lose this game, you lose the tiebreaker to Ohio State if they go 11-1. Oregon looks like they're well on pace to go undefeated through the regular season. They might have one loss, but then that's going to come down to tiebreakers that you can't control because you don't play them. And a similar situation for Indiana. They got to play Ohio State, but if Penn State and Indiana are both 11-1, it's going to come down to tiebreakers, and it's possible Indiana could get into a Big Ten title game over Penn State in some scenarios. So I think you're kind of drawing dead if you don't win this game in terms of the conference championship game. Do you think that's part of that? What you're bringing up there is people are baking this in as a loss because they just want to get into the top 12 and maybe not letting themselves dream because they don't think they have to, even though I think, if the goal is a national championship, this is still a huge game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly part of it. You look at a lot of the previous matchups against Ohio State, and once Penn State loses that game, it's like, well, they're eliminated from the playoffs, and then it just becomes, which New Year's Six Bowl are they going to? And you look at this year, obviously they could lose to Ohio State and win out and make the playoffs, or they could lose to Ohio State and potentially have one more loss and still make the playoffs. They kind of have a big buffer, and they've positioned themselves well based on the first 7 games of the season running the table. And I think 10-2 is probably still good enough to get in. And so if you're a Penn State fan, you're still thinking based on the history of going 10-2 every year and missing the playoffs, you're looking at this year and thinking 11-1, you're still getting in the playoffs. You're still going to be a relatively high seed, probably hosting, a home game at Beaver Stadium, which in some ways I think Penn State fans would rather host a Beaver Stadium game than get a first round bye, just because I think everyone wants to see what would happen to kind of the atmosphere there and what kind of environment we would get. But yeah, I think that does kind of ease things a little bit, which I think is funny because this is one of the few years where Penn State goes into the game as the higher ranked team. And like we talked about a little bit, this might be their best chance to win in recent history. And so it's funny that kind of the expectations are a little bit lower, but maybe that plays into Penn State's favor. Maybe the team feels less pressure to win this game. They're not as stressed out, and they're not going to go in and, make mistakes or get off to a slow start. And, maybe they just play kind of a looser game and a little bit more free, have a little bit more fun with it. And, it could play to Penn State's benefit, just kind of having lower stakes to the game. But yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything you said. I think, from the fans' perspective, I think there's a little bit less pressure. I think, they're kind of more willing to accept a loss here to Ohio State just because of, what you can still potentially do. And, if you play well enough, maybe you rematch them in the playoffs or something like that. So I think there is less pressure from the fans.
Joel, I also wanted to ask you about, we're talking about this college football playoff situation and obviously the implications of winning the Big Ten. You brought up something that I thought was interesting, which is I think a lot of people do want to see a Penn State playoff game at Beaver Stadium and wouldn't necessarily mind that, even if it makes the road to a national championship more difficult. I've been looking at some different builds of college football playoff brackets, and the thing that you keep seeing is if you're one of those top couple of seeds, which you would perceive Penn State to be if they won the conference. Obviously, there's a lot of if involved there, but let's say you beat Ohio State this week, you get Oregon in the national title game, you beat them, then you're kind of talking about you're going to face those lower seeded at-large teams rather than the path that Penn State is projected for here or Ohio State or whichever team gets that 5th or 6th seed. if you get the 5th seed or the 6th seed, you get to draw either the ACC or Big 12 champion in all likelihood, which is Kansas State, and that would be in the round of 8. So let's just say hypothetically in this build I'm looking at, Penn State's the 5th seed. They get Boise State at home in the first round, and then they go into the bowl game and they face Kansas State. Rather than if they're Oregon. Oregon is ostensibly the number 1 seed, but they would have to face either Miami or Texas A&M in this build that I'm looking at, these SEC teams. If you're Penn State, are those 5th and 6th seeds somewhat more attractive because you get that home game, and B, because you might have an easier road to the round of 4 than maybe an Oregon would that might have to draw an SEC team that maybe isn't the best team in the SEC, but might be the best team in the Big 12 or the ACC.
Yeah, that's definitely, an argument that you could make. And I think the biggest flaw with the current 12-team playoff is the auto bids for the 4 conference champions, because obviously we know the ACC and the Big 12 trail behind the SEC and the Big 10. And you could kind of argue a little bit about where they would fall, but I think you could say there are 3 teams, maybe 4 teams in the Big 10 who are better than any team in the Big 12. And yet, whoever comes out on top of the Big 12 is going to be, either that 3rd or 4th seed in the playoffs. And so obviously that makes things a little bit interesting because, like you mentioned, you get that 5th or 6th spot. You're playing one of the bottom teams in the bracket, either 11 or 12. You're getting them as a home game, which, you should be able to pencil it in as a win. Let's say Penn State's number 5. They get Boise State at home. Obviously, Ashton Genty's great and probably going to be a Heisman finalist and potentially win the Heisman. But, it's at the end of the day, it's a group of 5 team. And obviously the talent on Penn State's roster should be much higher than Boise State's, and Penn State, would be able to, hypothetically win that pretty easily. And then obviously your second round matchup would be against, a potential Big 12 or ACC champion, which, they're a power conference champion, but at the same time, it's not the SEC or the Big 10. And I think that's a very winnable game. So to your point, I think you could end up, and again, there are so many hypothetical situations, so it's hard to say definitively that, getting the 5 seed is better than the 1 seed or something like that. But there's certainly an argument to be made, and kind of depending on how, the bracket falls, I could definitely see that being the case where, the 5 seed has a better path. There's also something to be said for momentum and kind of getting an easier win in the first round, at your home stadium, kind of getting a playoff win under your belt and then kind of building off that. But there's also, playing the extra game increases the risk of, someone getting injured or something like that. So I think there's pluses and minuses, and I think it's too hard to definitively say, which seed is the more appealing. But I think, depending on how the bracket plays out, I think there's definitely an argument that the 5 seed would be the better seed to get.
Yeah, but to that point as well, I don't think that means you can take this game lightly, though, because it's possible you could end up with the 5th or 6th seed if you lose to Ohio State. But it's also very possible that if you lose to Ohio State and they go to the Big 10 title game, that they could end up as in that 5th and 6th seed, and you get bumped down to maybe a 7 or an 8 game where you still have a home game, but now you're probably facing a pretty good SEC team as opposed to like Boise State. So I didn't ask that question to diminish the stakes of this game. I think it only reinforces that if you get this win, even if you lose to Oregon in the conference title game, you can probably pencil them in for that 5 or 6. So a lot on the line for Penn State this week. Excited to watch the game, Joel. Excited to keep talking about the Nittany Lions. Joel is going to be doing his post-game show with Lyle, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Make sure if you like this video, if you enjoyed it, help us out in the YouTube algorithm, and also obviously stay tuned for all of our Steelers coverage this week of the bye. Christopher Carter on the North Shore Drive will be back on Friday. I'll be with Paul Zeiss Thursday on our Paul Zeiss live stream that we are workshopping right now. So plenty more coming your way. So sign up, and we will talk to you again all real soon.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.